This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
This yes. Change.
Elections have to go because I've got to record it. No.
So this is the digital
But I've changed some of my slides.
I mean, sure.
So you've added to that.
I haven't. Yes. I've got my own.
Okay.
Do you want to start things?
Yeah, I will.
give you slides. Would that be easier?
Where are yours?
Down here,
Oh,
but I can put them
yeah, could
on
you?
USB, right?
Or I can. If I put them on a USB, if I would like to put them on LMS for the students, if that's sure. If you don't mind me doing
not
that.
at all. Not at all. They are typically very heavy. That's the only. They are very. Oh, right. I need to do that. They're very heavy, as in they'll be. Sorry, meaning that they've got large images.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That should be okay.
It's more for them, or you for your USB.
The USB is it's a monster. It's a TARDIS. It's extraordinary.
That's good. TARDIS USBs are good.
It just means you fill up with more rubbish.
Yeah, it's 42 megs, so
Okay.
it is kind of low rubbish. Right.
Yeah, it's too late now. Yeah.
Theory, meaning that you guys do different types of theories or awesome. Makes me happy. Okay. Right.
So,
How much else happens
oh no.
so last minute?
Got some cold.
You do this one, you do, presumably do another one at least. Or is this the only one you do, of course?
No, I do the undergraduate students past and future as well. So, and plenty of other things besides. What am I looking at?
MA. Planning theory.
Yeah. So that might be fun. It's not like a major.
I'm just scared. I always have 3 times as many slides as I need. I just put it on things.
Just in case.
Yeah, the material they'll actually rather than just going to literature reading.
Like that. Super.
Oh no, it's just
Thinking
it's
as
because
they
it's
say.
heavy.
Yeah. Better think of
just let him be for a bit, just in case.
wow, it's got a lot to think about here.
You know, it must be. I started thinking there's probably one image in there that it's really annoying.
Yeah, right.
There's one image. Get rid of it. So, anyway, I'll get out of
I'll
it.
introduce Nora. Okay, thank you for all turning up on week 12. Thank you. Okay, today we're really lucky. For the first, for the first part of our session today, we've got a new professor here at the University of Melbourne, Professor Michaela Okuto. He's going to give us a lecture based on some of his current research. I sent out a bio of Michaela's bio. So Michaela has come to us from UCL, but he has had a very international background and working as well in urban studies and urban politics. So thank you, Michaela, for making the time today. Thank you.
That was the cue for do something now. Am I?
Yes.
Okay. Good. You never know. Hey guys. First lecture that I do here formally, so just bear with me. I don't know the format and or the backgrounds that you've got, but I'm told you're mostly planners or wannabe planners, so that's good. As Catherine said, before I did this, I joined from the University College London. There's a faculty called the Bartlett School of the Built Environment, which is a bit of a it's a bit like MSD. We do a bit of everything in there, and I used to run a centre called the City Leadership Lab. So I've read the brief as to the sort of things you do. We settled, Catherine and I, on giving you a bit of a background on issues and challenges as it pertains to city leadership or urban governance, if you want to call it a bit simpler. But I thought I'd show you a few bits of research that we had been doing there, that I'm doing over here at the moment, and we'll do more of here at MSD. But as it pertains to issues of governance, urban governance, of planning, and how that's changing. So I wanted to focus on a few bits, especially the issue of power, who's got power, how, when, why, and the issue of networking, which I know you probably have mentioned or heard a bit before as well. Stop me anytime. I tend not to do this. In London, we tend to sit around tables. So ask questions, stop me, contradict me, tell me that's wrong. Very happy to chat through and see what you think about this sort of things. Typically, I take a quite international cut and quite comparative. I'm sort of fairly comparative by nature. My background is politics and law, more than planning. But I've worked quite a bit in strategic and master planning with a company called ARP for quite some time now, nearly a decade. So, without further ado in things, but raise your hand, shout, and tell me to stop anytime. Two little bits. First and foremost, what I mean by city leadership is not just there's a bit of a love and flair with the idea of the mayor these days, and you hear a lot about mayors. I tend to take a bit of a broader cut. What I mean is the structure that allows to govern a city or an urban area. And what I'm going to refer to, so I'm just going to throw you some numbers. I'm a big fan of numbers and data and database assumptions. This doesn't mean big data, it simply means using evidence when you say stuff. I think it's a sort of fairly basic thing that any planner should do, is talk on the basis of evidence rather than talk on the basis of assumptions and thoughts. But the numbers I'm going to show you tend to all to be based on 2 or 3 pieces of work that we've done. One is a review of 250 cities globally. Reason why I use that data set and those numbers is put your assumptions and discussions in context. Don't rely just on this is what happens in Melbourne, or this is what happens in Beijing, or this is what happens in London, and don't assume that all cities look like Melbourne or Beijing or London. So I'm trying to use a sort of a fairly broad comparative cut. When I say all cities, I mean all 250 cities. I'm very conscious that there's more than 250 cities globally. And I'll use a bit of data from that. There's a bit of data from the work that we've done with a group of cities called the C40 Climate Leadership Group, which gathered the 96 largest cities on the planet. So that's a specific type of cities. And I'll rely on a few sort of smaller data sets. But in general, the interest here is what's happening to city leadership, where is it going, what sort of key drivers are there. Now, before any such considerations, you sort of have to start thinking, okay, there's some fundamental embedded problems with the leadership and the governance of cities and the governance of planning per se. Fundamental problems that I always start with the massive gender imbalance. We could do this on cultural as well, but 85% of people in charge of cities globally are male. Fundamental imbalance number two is, surprisingly or not, that 85% of people in charge of cities are elected, which is a substantial chunk, more or less democratically elected. We can get into that discussion, but nonetheless gone through a process of election and are appointed by people. Directly appointed is a small minority. Other forms of patronage or control are very limited. So globally, for the most part, city leadership looks male and elected. And globally, it tends not to last that long. You have examples of mayors that have been in charge forever, some of which have been classic cases in for instance, in Australia, just on the corner in Sydney. But generally, globally, mayors and city leaders that are elected last for about 4 years. Now, the reason why that's a problem or that's an issue is that strategic plans globally all last longer than what mayors last like. Yeah. So, and again, if you take a subset of 250 cities globally, it might change a bit if you take into account very small towns. But typically, strategic urban plans globally have a timelines of a very minimum of 6 years. In fact, 6 years is the classic minimums globally. Central Asia, South Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. In the Middle East, it isn't uncommon. That's an area and a place where I've worked quite a lot. I've worked on 2 successive master plans for Dubai, the master plan for Muscat in Oman. The typical time frame of strategic planning there is anything between 20 and 50 years. And they're not just visions, they're tangible plans. They might have an average of 28 years. Asia and the Pacific around here, you're talking about 17 years. But the difference that I'm dragging there is people in charge last not long, but are elected. Their plans tend to last much longer than them. But the plans change substantially on what they focus on. So globally, if you think about what's in these plans, fads and things, I suspect I presume you talked about resilience or last time. Awesome, I read you correctly. We don't have data on resilience and where does resilience sit in this, but sustainability is the 101 of roughly every plan globally. Globally, that means that more than 67% of cities have a dedicated strategy, which means not just part of a plan, even though globally nearly 50% of strategic plans include at their core sustainability considerations. On top of that, 67% of cities globally have sustainability plans explicitly out there. Other things, safety, smart, are in fact even more surprising. 74% of cities globally do now have dedicated smart plans. These vary massively from a one-pager statement of we're going to make this place much smarter to actually very intricate, I think there's 197 pages long strategic plan on smart development for the city of Aalborg in Denmark. So this varies substantially. But in general, what's interesting in there, and the reason why I'm starting from this before getting into the meat of the story, is it's quite important to understand, not just get sort of seduced by the image of the mayor and the person in charge, but ask yourself what is the structure that sits behind it, what is the structure of leadership that leads to these type of things, so sort of to strategic planning and strategic plans and strategic interventions locally. So on that front, what I wanted to sort of talk a bit about is how this type of structure is changing, shifting, what sort of things are going in which direction and how. If I say urban governance, presuming that you've done something on this, what do I mean? And that changes dramatically. You don't need to try and read it. It's tiny for a purpose. But that's what urban governance looks like in London, for instance. That typically you could say who's in charge of London, and your answer would be somewhere in the middle, the mayor of London. If you've followed anything about London, you'd recognize a face or a name like Sadiq Khan, or if you haven't, but you like funny things, you probably heard of Boris Johnson, etc., etc. Now, the structure of who governs London, and governing for me is very tangible. We're talking about who decides how many buses go in front of my apartment in the morning, who picks up my trash, what do we do with that trash, who turns on the lights or doesn't at night. Now, the answer to that type of stuff is extremely complicated in reality, that it isn't just a question of who the mayor is. So, for instance, the governance of waste is determined by a bunch of government departments that are at national level, that collaborate or not with a bunch of departments within a municipality, that collaborates or not with an authority called the Greater London Authority, that coordinates a regional context and so forth. So all of that sort of gives you sort of much more complex spectrum of people and things in charge of stuff. That's dreadfully generic, but that's what it practically is. And that's changing substantially internationally. So internationally, for instance, and you have lots of good examples down here, we've seen a massive rise in interest for reforming or forming regional authorities or metropolitan authorities. So in London, if you ask the question, who's in charge of London 10 years ago, the answer would be dramatically different. But as of the constitution of a thing called the Greater London Authority, that picture changed substantially, gravitating towards what's at the center, the Mayor of London structure. Questions are, is that what's happened? It seems that it is what has happened to Auckland, for instance, just just across the water, and the creation of a single council that manages the whole area. Is that the direction that, for instance, a place like Sydney is taking or not? Typically been splintered into 30-plus authorities, has created a city-wide or urban-wide authority. Where is that authority going or not? In general, the story of city leadership, and I'll skip a couple of things, but the story of city leadership internationally tends to be, if you take sort of that 250 cities look, it tends to be a pretty common story. Fragmentation and complication of the governance system. So creation of multiple authorities, creations of multiple subunits within those authorities, creation of authorities that are shared between different layers of government, at the same time of relative growth. There is cities that are shrinking in terms of population, in terms of economics or economy, in terms of other things like logistics. But in general, the story tends to be cities are growing and their structure, their governance structure is becoming more and more complicated. Which gets me to point number one, power. What does power looks like, or what does the power of city leadership look like internationally? Now, does anyone have a quantitative background? Has anyone studied science here before? Anything scientific? Can anyone tell me what's the correlation between the dots on the graph? No? No one?
I saw a hand going up over there.
No? Yeah? No? There's no correlation whatsoever between the dots on the map. And if you can find one, bring it on. This is taking a smaller set, taking the C40 cities, so the near 100 largest cities on the planet, and asking the question, is a bigger, more powerful city more active and influential than a smaller city? Or is London more powerful and influential than, I don't know, Birmingham or Adelaide when it comes to doing things? And interestingly, one of the things we learned by working with the C40 was the answer is actually no. There's no direct correlation between lots of planned and carried out actions. Actions meaning anything like setting up a new cycling lane or changing zoning on parks, etc., and the power of a city. And bear with me with that, and I'm very happy to debate it or not. But number one, it doesn't necessarily mean the very powerful does a lot. Number two, when you take the powers, so what you're looking at is the columns are the percentage of cities that have power or capacity to do things in the specific areas that you've got there. So, for instance, 82% of cities internationally, when you take the C40 group, have the power to do things about it. And the dot is how many cities are actually doing things about that area. So, for instance, if you take waste, if 82% of cities in C40 can do things about waste, the amount of cities that are taking action on waste is bigger than the ones that have power. Now, that's a common story internationally across pretty much the whole board, besides one outlier sector or area that is becoming more and more interesting, which is the one of outdoor lighting, where in fact less cities do things about it than the ones that can do something about it. So number one, having power doesn't mean doing things. Number two, in fact, you do more, and typically international cities do more than that they actually have power. And the classic, incredible case is in reality the case of ICTs. 66% of cities are doing things about information and communication technologies. If you remember, I was flagging 75% of cities globally have some form of plan for smart cities, even though in reality ICTs is typically out of the domain of local government and municipal management. Just about 25% of cities have some capacity to do something about it. Now, the point is the power, when you think about what kind of power do cities have to do stuff, is a complex conversation. It isn't just having a lot of money. It isn't just about being able to do plans or issue laws and regulations. It isn't just about owning stuff, or it isn't just about having control over things. Control of the police or enforcing the laws that you put. Is a complex of those four things. So when you disaggregate the store of power, in fact, it's a fairly complex story that you can't quite simply simplify in statements like, oh, obviously London is doing a lot of this, or obviously Melbourne is doing a lot of this, because it's a really big place, or it's a really powerful place. So internationally, that changes a lot when you start splitting it. So in the case of that, what we meant by power is a split of those four dimensions. That you could, for instance, and there's quite a lot of cities, as in typically cities, for instance, if you look at being able to set your own policies and enforcing them, the majority of cities, 68%, can do that, can set a policy and try to enforce it. But for instance, there's only about 29% of cities that actually control their budget. So you can well set your plan, but you don't know, or you have very limited control where the money for that plan comes from, or how much money do you have. Or that typically lots of cities own and operate their own assets, but lots means about 57%. So in reality, there isn't a lot of cities. There's still nearly half of cities internationally that don't own and operate their assets. So you can do a fantastic plan to encourage the use of green spaces. You can try and enforce how that use is done, but you then give out the operation and the ownership of that green space, or you have to lease out the operation and ownership of that green space to a private actor, another layer of government, and so forth. And the last bit about power, or the second last bit about power, is that internationally, if you split cities by the type of governance that they have, and that we've done by splitting it, for instance, by how top-down and single-minded in a sense they are. So when we talk about implementing on command these cities, we're talking about cities that have a lot of power and they use it by themselves to direct the things that they do. Versus, say, collaborating cities, which are cities that have very limited power, but they tend to do things in partnership because they have limited power. So, for instance, lots of public-private partnerships, lots of collaboration with other layers of government. Now, if you ask yourself which ones are the ones of these types of cities that are delivering things on the ground, what you see in the light blue bit is, first of all, it is the cities that have limited power and do a lot of collaboration, or the ones that have limited power but can legislate, are the ones that do the most. And equally, it is the ones that collaborate and legislate that are the ones that do the most at a city-wide scale. That if you're really powerful, you might be able to implement a really significant pilot program somewhere, but you're far less likely to scale it up to be a city-wide initiative, which tends to matter quite a bit along the lines of not serving just a small part of your constituency, but the whole of the urban dweller population. And the other big myth is that cities don't have money to do things, which is quite incorrect in reality. So what you're looking at there is where does the money come from when cities do stuff or implement projects and plans and actions. And the point is not that cities don't have money, but that the money they have is almost all entirely spent. In fact, the majority of funding for actions and plans by local government comes from local government itself. And in fact, the majority of that is carried out at a city-wide scale rather than a small, say, community, neighborhood, street corner scale. The problem with that is that that takes out pretty much all the budgetary capacity of cities. That in fact, actually, there's very limited funding that comes, but it's very popular in the media from toll and user and charges and adding a fee for something when you do a program. It's virtually in the single digits of percentages internationally. In general, the problem there is, first of all, the cities don't want to talk about their budgets. On the top, before I get to the bottom, which is the next bit that I want to talk you through, where are city budgets going? Besides the 25% of cities that don't want to tell you where are their budgets going, which I suspect is a code for they're either really good or really bad, in general, city budgets are either decreasing or stable, which is why that's important. That there's not more money coming into local government to do stuff. And there's a limited amount of cities that are in the my budget is increasing, my budget has had a substantial increase. And that's quite different from an element of city leadership that I think you've heard before, but it's often sort of undervalued and not particularly talked about, which is sort of the network element. The budgets for city corporations or city networks, so formal organizations that have more than a couple of cities that are designed to share resources or information or activities or advocacy programs and so on between cities, is in fact increasing. There's more and more interest in that. Now, that means looking at the picture that way, which is something that in urban studies it's been quite typical for quite some time. So looking at the connections between cities. That's the very typical, if you've done anything on this front, of the store of the global city. So which ones are the most connected cities and how and where and through what networks. But in reality, that kind of story you can tell it as it pertains to city leadership and urban governance as well. So the connection between cities and what do they practically mean. And what they practically mean, that's just a map of all the sort of bilateral or trilateral, so partnership between Melbourne and Tokyo, partnership between Tokyo, Seoul, and Sydney, connections globally. The networking of city leadership is not just a European or a northern story. It is so the yellower or redder the map, the more connections, and obviously that means clearly Europe is a classic place where this has been typical, and there's been a lot of connecting between cities to deliver and do stuff. But it happens quite often, very typical in Latin America, North America. It happens, and it's been happening quite regularly in East Asia. That in fact you can go down to pretty small, I don't know if there's anyone from Indonesia, but you can go to pretty small places, even in the Asia Pacific, and find quite a substantial amount of international, transnational connections. So for instance, that's the example of Solo, just near Jakarta in Indonesia, and the fact that actually it's been a fairly internationally connected city. In general, what does that mean? Internationally, the number of formalized partnerships of cities has been growing steadily, and it's a typical thing that we've had forever. Now, we started that from the late 1800s because it's convenient, but in reality, that's a story that you had in the Middle Ages as well. But contemporary modern forms of city networking, so things like 5 mayors from 5 different countries getting together and deciding to share things about transportation or climate action and so forth. The number of those has been growing steadily throughout the last century. It's typically been things like the National League of Cities, Mayors for Peace, that are based on advocacy and campaigning, and progressively become something more about delivering and doing stuff. So for instance, if you look at what, so there's about, today, give or take, you can count about 300 of these networks. So 300 formalized, institutionalized partnerships of multiple cities that are doing things internationally. The question is what do they do? They've typically focused on governance. They typically focused on advocating on things around governance. But climate and sustainability has become now sort of the biggest growth in interest and networking internationally. So 36% of networks that have been born in the last decade have been focused on climate and sustainability. That does not mean that it is just an environmental story. So there is a good number of networks that focus on things like peace. There's a really common and long-standing Middle Eastern association focused on planning and using planning as a tool for peace building between Palestinian and Israeli municipalities. There's been an exchange for 6 years, unfortunately stopped 2 years ago, but between Iranian and Israeli municipalities about sustainable transport planning. So there is lots of these type of initiatives. But the two things to flag here are, first of all, these things are becoming more and more international. So there's more and more push for city leaders to connect with their peers internationally. And second of all, they don't just go and have canapes. It isn't just the whole thing where they go to conferences and they meet and they all shake hands and so on. City networks produce reports, newsletters, policies. Nearly 33% of city networks internationally develop joint policies, which means they develop joint programs that hit the ground and shape how they collect garbage, for instance, or how they turn on the light at night. And that's becoming more and more important because of that is happening in sort of this large landscape of international commitments and international efforts. So cities are not just going out there and doing things, but once they're out there, they encounter things like the United Nations, like the World Bank, like regional development banks, large conglomerates, multinational companies. So by being out there, by becoming, in a sense, more and more international, cities encounter a whole landscape of governance that you wouldn't see if you focus just on the local story, on the local part of city leadership, in a sense. Now, why is that important? that's important because then when you take the story of how Melbourne is governed, or how even a small city like Birmingham is governed in its international context, you don't just notice this type of stuff, so the international story, the international governance commitments, but you inevitably notice that city leadership is more and more embedded in sort of large processes and large connections and large markets and so forth. So for instance, that's great stuff that the folks up at Harvard are doing on planetary urbanization to show how interconnected the whole of urbanization it is, and how dependent it is in reality, even the littlest things. The paper typically has changed, luckily, but typically the paper on which the Sydney Morning Herald was printed is recycled paper, but typically a good percentage of that paper, up to 70%, would every day be crumbled into a bin, packed, put on a cargo that would put it on a ship that would bring it over to China or nearby China to be recycled, to be sent back to Australia to print, probably not the next day, but a couple of days after paper. So cities exist in these type of chains, global value chains, and large processes that define their power. How do they define their power? There's companies, I'll go back to this in a second, that are present across the whole lot of cities globally. That's before I get to that. How many of you notice what's written on the garbage truck that picks up trash in front of? Awesome. What do you know what the company is that picks up your trash?
I ran my own garbage company for 10 years, so it's
Yay! Were you, if you can say it, a subsidiary of one of four that I can mention? CETA? You were, okay.
No, I run my own, but CETA, I know CETA. Suez runs
Awesome.
Collex, I think.
Can you name anyone else?
In Melbourne, I just know the big ones like JJ Richards, but they're not global.
Yeah, which kind of tend to work with that.
Veolia.
Awesome. Yes, indeed. And basically, what you've done there is you've just named 78% of the global waste management system. So there's companies you maybe don't notice until you actually pay attention to who picks up your trash in the morning. So you read, that's in Sydney, by the way, but you read, okay, it says City of Sydney, but it will say operated by, and there's a name underneath that. Now, typically, you do read that name Suez or that name Veolia, and so on. And they're huge companies that not only operate the majority of waste management, but they operate the majority of electricity management, the majority of water management, and so forth. And they do that, so those are the largest, single largest projects, private projects globally at the moment. Their investments in the 30 billion size. Things like lowly Veolia that picks up your trash, manage 75% of an industry waste that is $135 billion a year. These are not small things. And even if you're doing your own waste management plan or water delivery plan or energy saving plan in a specific city, you have to relate to these sort of things. So even if you're changing your light bulbs because you decided to do more sustainable traffic lighting, that's very likely that you will have to deal with one or two companies, Siemens or General Electric, globally, no matter how big or small your place is. Now that's fundamental because the role of companies in the private sector in city leadership is changing substantially and is shaping the powers and the capacities of city to do things. But it's also taking urban governance roles. I don't know if anyone knows what do you know what WeWork is? Does anyone know WeWork? No? It's a co-working or work-sharing space company. Provides a little funky, not even too little, fairly sizable now funky working spaces. They tend to be quite hipstery. There tends to be free drinks in it. And so forth. You pay a fee and you have your own working space there. And it's even developing a thing called WeLive, which is the same idea but applied to accommodation. So you rent a space, and then you, with your co-livers, vote on what to put in that space and change, and all of a sudden you get rid of your tennis court and you make it a cinema and so forth. Anyway, things like WeWork are becoming actually quite substantial actors in shaping urban governance. Example in point, WeWork has worked with Tel Aviv, the municipality of Tel Aviv, for the last 10 years now. It started as discussing their capacity to open these working spaces. It moved on to suggesting to the local government what to do about smart development and infrastructure and ICTs, which then moved into, why don't you guys come about at our normal Tuesday morning executive council meeting, which then moved on to, oh, we're doing a new strategic plan, why don't you come along and give us a few thoughts about the strategic plan. And WeWork is now a regular presence, and it's a private company, it's non-elected or and accountable to its shareholders, not the people that elect the mayor of Tel Aviv, but it's a regular presence in strategic planning in Tel Aviv, for instance. So in a sense, what's important to think about that is that cities, first of all, the store of power and the capacity to deliver becomes a bit more muddled than just, oh, we have a really powerful mayor, but also the story of the whole structure behind that power changes quite substantially, because internationally then you have to take into account these type of things. So the role of the private sector, not just in delivering, but in setting the strategic priorities. And it isn't a case that, where was it? If it loads, smart cities are a very widely spread focus for strategic planning. They are very widely spread focus for strategic planning because there have been fairly sizable companies behind it that has pushed local governments into planning strategically for smart innovation and smart development in cities. So in a sense, you have to account for that type of dynamic. You have to account for the complexity. So for instance, safety has not typically been on the top of the agendas. And you can account for a good chunk of that 47% of cities that have a strategy for urban safety as actually having been pushed by basically three things. In fact, the whole of it. Either minor element, public opinion, or much more likely, the United Nations Safer Cities Program, which has been going around for about 12 years, trying to convince cities to develop safety strategic plans or safety plans, or a company called Thales. Does anyone know Thales? Does that ring a bell? I love that typically the most pervasive companies are the ones we don't know the names of. Thales owns and operates a substantial chunk, namely nearly all, of monitoring and CCTV or CCV systems, so cameras and systems by which we control what happens in places for safety. And Thales has literally just gone around and convinced the cities to develop safety plans. Whether that's self-interested or not, I'll leave it to you to decide. So in a sense, first of all, that's a story that's complicated, and second of all, that the international, the outward-looking element is fundamental. And internationally, cities are recognizing this. So for instance, when you ask cities, and again, I'm talking only about 250 internationally, but when you ask cities, do you have a strategy to manage this type of international engagement, this type of outward engagement? And nearly 70% of cities globally do have some form of international engagement or international collaboration or international management strategy. And nearly 35% of cities globally, on a daily basis, relate to other cities by making a phone call, sending an email, and so on. So share things with other cities. There's almost no cities that, for instance, do this just on an annual basis. Almost all cities are tightly interconnected with other cities. Almost all cities, 88%, do engage with big things like the United Nations. but they typically do that via other actors. So the majority of cities tend to connect to one of those 200, 300 city networks, and then connect to things like the United Nations. And in fact, that's typically done in a really different way depending on the topic that you're talking about. Has anyone heard of any of those four? The Paris Agreement on Climate Change? Anyone? Couple? That's a start. Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, that's just probably heard of them all then in that case. That's typical. The problem is actually very large international frameworks and initiatives and money behind other things are far less typical for cities. So 82% of cities globally have never heard and or related at all with a thing called the UN Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Sounds very esoteric, but it's basically the United Nations framework that tells you what to do when a disaster hits a place. Why is it important? It's based and centered on the insurance industry, which tends to own and control what you do with your assets when you get a flood, when you get a fire, when you get a storm, and or other things. So internationally, these things matter a lot, but for cities themselves, it still remains really confusing and complicated of what it is. I guess that what happens, though, is the encounter with the private sector is shaping a lot what kind of governance cities are relating to. So that's the kind of governance that is being encouraged by the private sector into cities as a data-driven, pragmatic, focused type of governance that gels really well with that type of story that I had before. So in general, just to get it to a point of wrap up of what am I yabbering about. A couple of things. Being big doesn't mean doing a lot. Having power over something doesn't necessarily mean doing or not doing something. In fact, typically, that still does the majority of cities are doing things on areas and sectors that they don't have control, power, ownership over. That is, in fact, mostly the cities that go out there, collaborate, partner, that are the ones that are delivering and doing the most, and delivering and doing the most at a citywide scale. So for the benefit or the impact on, up to you, the majority of their citizens. That there is money, but that money is almost all committed. So cities are putting their money where their mouth is. The question is there more money for it? And where does that money come from? Which probably then takes you to, it comes from extremely large actors that are very international, that connect a lot of cities, and they own and operate and set and push for certain visions that define the way sort of cities are orienting themselves. But it does come from the encounter of cities with other cities. That cities talk to each other and they share ideas about doing stuff, and they share joint policies and things, even to the tune of sharing services and buying buses, for instance, together in a joint procurement scheme. So in that dimension, in reality, city leadership globally is changing quite a bit. Now, these things are not changing dramatically, and these things are not changing dramatically. But I guess where I wanted to leave it there was, in general, the real question is how does that complex store of leadership that isn't just about the mayor, that is about partnership, that is about delivering even if you don't control, and that is about coping with a private sector that is highly international, how does that influence then the priorities and the direction of planning on the ground? So on that front, I suppose I'll leave it at there, but I'm happy to unpack anything that was confusing or annoying or that you disagree on, and yell at me. All yours. Bring it on.
I just have a couple of questions. One,
The more the better.
5% of the measures are elected democratically. But
Elected. I said elected. Democratic, through a democratic process. As some kind.
there are these big companies that are passing through policy? Because for sure you are
Yep.
not going to support one network between two cities if you don't have any interest.
Yep.
And we are seeing that 75% of the waste is managed only by one company or
For three and a
three
half.
companies. Okay.
Yeah.
25%.
It's really, really open as a market, if you
It's
think.
not,
Yeah.
a bit uncomfortable, the lack of competence and that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that power because they are setting policies and it seems like maybe some policies that can be contrary to the market, maybe not supported in the way that they should be supported.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking that 85% are elected to the people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
The market is central in that.
Absolutely.
So it's not
Absolutely.
comfortable.
No, absolutely. And I suppose that, and you put it much better than I did, the political economy, not just the market, and it is a global political economy. No matter if you're working on Geelong or on Tokyo or Tokyo-to, which is Tokyo plus Yokohama, the global political economy there is fundamental because it pushes you in certain directions or another. They are uncomfortable. It's inevitable. Virtually inevitable. And the interesting part is typically we don't train local government officers or even regional government officers for that matter in negotiation, in networking, in international political economy. Where the majority of that stuff happens is not a fancy international forum with the mayor. It's on your Tuesday morning meeting between the city of whatever, the city council in Wollongong and a representative of Siemens that have to agree on some things. That's where actually all the international networking happens. I've worked in the Uber v Greater London Authority dispute. The Uber international negotiation team is 35 people, half of which are either trained at Yale, Harvard, or Oxford. The entirety of the GLA negotiating team for that case was 3 people, 2 of which had never worked in transport. So the imbalance there is substantial, if that makes sense.
Another question at the back, yeah?
Yeah, I was just going to ask sort of what do you think about, do you think Melbourne needs a new metropolitan governance strategy?
Melbourne?
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. So I was always a bit 50-50. I lived in Australia and worked on Australia before. So I had been in the UK for 10 years, nearly 10 years before coming here. And had I not been in London, I would have probably had a slightly different appreciation of the value of something like the Greater London Authority. But it was in London, so I worked quite substantially on the case for the Greater Sydney Commission and the discussion with New South Wales. There's pros and cons. The pros are desperate need, which for instance is happening on resilience in Melbourne, to have a comprehensive plan for something. If there's a flood, there's a bushfire, it's not in Geelong, it's in the whole of the place. So need for joint planning, that's a plus. Need for big picture view, that's a plus. Because the development of a new airport or Tullamarine to downtown speed rail to get people to the airport fast has implications or not. And it does work better at the layers of government. The power of the GLA, in fact, lots of British cities have gone into that model. Manchester has moved into that model, for instance, and so forth. And it puts a person in charge. I am a fan of mayors, actually. If they're elected, because at least I know who the bloody person in charge is. If it's not doing the job, I can at least try and vote the person out. Downside, it can be swayed by the private sector. Private sector loves it because it's agglomeration and hence easier to do business with. And if you take the Greater Sydney Commission, the biggest voice behind the Greater Sydney Commission was the Committee for Sydney, and was the voice of the private sector pushing for that authority. Hence, you get Lucy Turnbull as a person in charge. So plus and minuses, and I guess that the joined up regional planning, the problem with that, it doesn't leave out for specificity of their specific local or neighbourhood needs. That the Sydney new CBD plan, or the multiple cities plan, or the ideas of new airports. We've seen it in Toronto, for instance, have an implications because you have very specific needs. So it's a 50-50%, but I'll take that chance. At least there's someone in charge and there's a plan, I guess.
So just on your
Yep.
your power and action sort of slide, did you measure if the action was any good or not?
I'll be very honest. No, and that was then I say that with my hat, at least as my own individual hat, as much as the University College London hat, rather than the C40 Climate Leadership Group hat. But up until 2 to 3 years ago, in fact, that wasn't even the interesting part. The interesting part for things like Bloomberg Philanthropies and Climate Leadership Group and so on was how much is being scaled up. Hence the term by C40 transformative. And then the big debate, which maybe we're going to resolve or not, but that popped up in the last year and a half, saying that something is citywide also doesn't tell you if it's impactful. And the reason why I know that is that I worked on the plan for, or they called it a master plan, but the strategic plan for the Dubai Metro. The Dubai Metro is one of the longest ones on the planet. It's one of the most modern on the planet, but up until 3 years ago, when we lowered the fee to an affordable amount, it was just a tourist gimmick. So it was citywide, but was it impactful or not? Probably negatively impactful. So yeah, the whole story of impact, the whole story of you're doing more than what you have powers on, but is it making a difference or not? But anecdotally, you can say it does in lots of places. So yeah, that's one of the most critical things at the moment. Impact.
Excellent. We've got time for one more question. That clock is actually wrong if we're working on that clock up there, Michaela.
Yeah, that's good. I'm good. There's a clock here, and it's 1. So.
Oh, it's 1. Okay, cool. I think some really good questions have been raised because Michaela and also questions have pointed to as well the progressive blending of the public and private. And we're probably reaching a new level. We don't know some of the implications, and so that's your question was very good. And so it probably points to more research, as Michaela's indicated. We've got some anecdotal, but there's a strong role there for research about it, articulate what are some of the impacts and outcomes really, as we've gone to a whole new level of urban governance, of that blending of public and private. So what is the role for government, the role for governance, and so yeah, really interesting. So thank you, Michaela, for your time today. So
thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we're just going to break for a very quick 5 minutes and we'll come back, and then Dave and I are going to do a summary over the course, which will hopefully be helpful for your exam. So,
should have probably listened to the summary of the course first.
Sorry?
I should have probably listened to the summary of the course first.
Oh, no, it's good because I can
My bad.
No, I can incorporate some more what you said into the summary.
Just very quick strategic question. Does that mean that this... Okay, that's fine. That's a strategic question. Does that mean that...
Well, of course I've got time.
Okay, so we'll get started. So what we're doing now, David and I will provide a brief summary over the course. Of course, I'll focus on the theory, and then David will focus on the history. Thank you to those great questions as well. I think I really pointed in, and you'll see how this urban governance discussion very much, of course, features in the contemporary debates. So they were great questions. Okay, so what I want you to take away from this course, I hope you've taken something away, of course. But I suppose as you progress through your planning education, for me, I hope there's 5 key learnings or 5 key aspects which I think you can take through your planning education and further, of course, within your working life, or if you decide to do a PhD, of course. So the first one, I think, is the origins of planning thought. What are they? I'll just quickly list them, then I'm going to talk to each of these 5 key points quickly. So we focus on the origins of planning thought and its current influence. Of course, there's been a massive rift, we'll talk about that in a moment. The alarming dominance of new urbanology in the current urban conversation. We imagine applying within Michaela's talk the influence of new urbanology and how is it filtering through. For example, within the networks, it has to be, it can't not be, and how is that influencing outcomes? So there's a really good research question for someone who wants to do a minor thesis. The sustainability project has failed. That's quite a significant statement to make. But scholars are making that. Kaika and Swindido from Manchester particularly are. So the concept of resilience has moved quite quickly into urban policy. And we've seen that and have had a look at that. But I think the key question is, and this is a key question as well for urban governance as well, but also for resilience, is will it actually be able to deliver better outcomes? So the question around impact was great. So C40 is saying it's producing, I think it's 11,000 actions, but what does that mean for impact? And that's a key aspect. And impact in what? We think about those 3 E's, the economic, environment and equity. So impact where? So those outcomes, those climate actions that were listed for the C40, are they distributed equitably, for example? We don't know. So it points again to that question. And then as planners, we need to find spaces for better planning in a neoliberal world. And I don't want to be too negative about networks, so I work in that area as well. And that quite possibly could be one of these spaces to hopefully provide for better planning, but we don't know yet. Okay, to summarise just a bit more, and these slides hopefully will help you as well to sort of set up your framework around revision for the exam as well. So as I said, the origins of planning thought and its current influence, unfortunately, particularly for critical social sciences, of which we all are, there's been a massive rift. So the origins, of course, go back to geography, but now, of course, planning thought has been very much influenced by the non-spatial and non-social scientific influences. So the non-spatial, of course, are the economists, they focus on efficiency, they do not look at distribution, or in general don't look at the environment as well. Some of the other non-social sciences as well are very much from the physical sciences. We didn't focus on that so much, but the physical sciences very much focus on the linear aspects of it. But I think key to the current influences are the traditional economists. So that's very new. So for planning thought, traditional economists have been having very much a part of the debate and a dominant part of the debate as well. So there is a current influence, and it's a significant rift from the origins of the planning thought, and points very strongly to the role of critical social sciences in the urban age. So that's all of us. And so then what I've done is just listed some of the key references which are in the readers as well, which relate to these specific 5 key learnings or lessons or whatever you want to call them. There are a couple of additional readings, but I'll point to those. There's only 2, so there's not many. Of course, we're at this situation now. We've got this alarming dominance of new urbanology in the current urban conversation. And that's, I suppose, is of no surprise, unfortunately, because if you think about it, since the 70s, neoliberalism has been very strong within particularly the Western discourse. That has fed through, of course, into neoliberal urbanism. And of course, we saw with the new urbanologists that their conceptual understanding of urban futures is underpinned by neoclassical economics. And that was very strong. So we're looking at, so think back, we looked at density being related to economic growth, overstated belief of technologies, the Erotropolis being very much related to around market efficiencies and productivities. So very much these urban futures, what they are actually doing is actually underpinning new forms of economic growth. So you've got to ask the question as planners, where is equity and distribution and the environment within these urban futures? So the solutions that they're providing aren't transformative at all. They're actually supporting the status quo, which is neoclassical economics. So as critical social sciences, we need to argue that these are new, that these new and influential urban schemes, actually they're not new, but the new urbanologists argue what they're putting forward is new, don't engage at all with the imperatives of critical social science. So here again, and these readers, all those 3 readers, articles, are in your reader. Okay, the next one, I think up to the 3rd one, I can't remember. The sustainability project failed. That may be a significant statement to make. I think it has, and scholars are pointing to that. And I think if you just look at the indicators around distribution, equality, the Gini coefficient, and some of our environmental implications, have we moved on climate change? No, you could pretty well summarise the sustainability project has failed. So we're moving into this concept of resilience, and we particularly spoke last week whether resilience will be able to break what we call this political ecological deadlock or not. But as planners and as critical social sciences, not only we need to be critical of resilience, whether it can or cannot deliver, or help us, or I suppose frame, so for example, metropolitan planners plans on a more just and equitable society. So it may provide a new frame, but it is unknown. So just to recap on that political ecological deadlock, what do we mean by that? So what we mean on that is in the sense, at the moment, interestingly, we've got a lot of information out there around urban environmental problems. We've got lots of different policies, particularly on sustainability. We've got emerging ones around resilience. Remember, resilience is very new to urban policy. But the thing is, we haven't moved. So we're still stuck, and that's why they call it a political ecological deadlock, is we're stuck. In a sense, sustainability hasn't been able to break open and to be able to deliver on a more just and equitable society. And that was what the hope was that was embedded within the Brundtland Report. So the Brundtland Report, the Brundtland Report of course had different political connotations and all sorts of things, but the hope within that report was to be able to deliver more of a just and equitable society, but we haven't been able to do it. And that's essentially because this deadlock is so strong. And the deadlock is so strong because of the strength of neoliberalism. And unfortunately, all that new urbanology does is actually makes that stronger. And for a concept like resilience, the idea like resilience, it's going to make it even harder to break it. So you can kind of see everything's all very interrelated. So Swinderdo, he talks about politicising the environments and the violence of the sustainable city. As I said, I don't like the word violence on many different levels. But what he's trying to point to, though, is that we need to unpack and think about what the contestations and the disagreements are. So what are the tensions? So as we talk about, you think about some of the different tensions. If we're thinking about if we want to live in more of sustainable futures, that may mean that we can't drive our car for as long as we want to. We have to think about where our food comes from, but we've got to think about, we've got to find spaces within planning to have these discussions on the tensions. Affluence as well is a significant one. So where we're going to have these discussions, where is the space going to be able to have the discussions about how we're going to have some form of transformation of the different structures. Because at the moment what we are doing, and we continue to do, is we're normalising neoliberal sustainability. And that's what new urbanology has done. And it's done it. And they've done it actually very well, unfortunately. So will resilience play a role in breaking this political deadlock? We don't know. So the concept of resilience has grown quite quickly. And even in one of Michaela's slides up there, he has sustainability, but did acknowledge he didn't have resilience up there. But resilience, for example, has moved into Plan Melbourne Refresh. So it is quite possibly could move on for sustainability, but we don't know whether resilience will be able to break this deadlock. So will resilience be able to provide a frame of where we can use that frame to embed, for example, in our metropolitan plans, to be able to hopefully provide some form of frame to deliver on more just and equitable societies, which of course have very strong environmental outcomes. Because the frame of sustainability is essentially how the new urbanologists are understanding urban futures. And we know that's based just in economics. So we somehow need to get the 3 E's back into the discussion. Sustainability hasn't been able to do it. So therefore, maybe we do need to look at a different frame or a different concept, and maybe that is resilience. So these are all in the reader as well. In the sense, you can see there's a very strong discussion around resilience. Academics are quite good at being sceptical. And so there is a lot of people who are sceptical on resilience, but also there's some people who are not. But essentially the jury's out. We actually don't know. So you just see by these titles that there is a very strong discussion around resilience. And a cautionary note around planners, like don't place too much hope on it. Is it a bridging concept? Will it be able to bridge us to a different frame? We don't know. We hope it does. Urban resilience, and what does it mean for planning practice? Of course, resilience has a very different understanding around incorporating equity in the environment than the normalising of neoliberal sustainable futures. Of course, reframing resilience to have the 3 E's within it will provide a challenge for planning theory and, of course, for practice as well, because within, particularly for practice, you're trying to move forward on that political deadlock a lot more. So that's going to be very, very challenging. So Resilient Melbourne is an excellent example. So if you have a look at Resilient Melbourne, I think it does actually give you some hope around the concept of resilience, and we did have a look at it through the lectures. It does have a strong emphasis on the socio and ecological. So it is a planning strategy, but it's not inbuilt within our metropolitan strategy here at Melbourne. So again, these are the references around this particular key theme. The Swindon 01, The Violence of Sustainability, is a public accessible document where a lot of academics are moving that way. So there's that link there. And to end up with, as planners, we need to find a space for a better planning in a neoliberal world. So we heard Libby Porter, in the sense of trying to find some better space within planning to particularly progress Indigenous rights, and she pointed to a treaty. City networks may or may not, we don't know yet, and Michaela gave some insights within that. And also the concept of resilience may provide some space for at least a discussion about that the sustainability project has failed because it doesn't incorporate those 3 E's. So it may find some space within that, even if resilience isn't able to break that political deadlock. There may provide some space to talk about how we can actually find some space for better planning in this very strong neoliberal world we live within. The last of those readers, the last one you don't have, and I'll post that on LMS on Readings Online. And that's it. I'll hand over to David to have a talk about the history and the exam.
Oh, thank you, Catherine.
I'll let you do.
Isn't it an insane part of the semester, and you get to the last, you don't need me to tell you, you get to the last few weeks of the semester and you're just like everything is too much, and I can't believe that we're in week 12. What?
Stirring.
It's what it's like. It's what it's like. It is what it's like. Oh, God, it's what it's like for me, I don't know. I'm the oldest person in this room, I guess. So, look, I want to talk briefly about the exam. Catherine and I had I hope it was a friendly argument last week about the value of exams, and I think it's really worth talking about very quickly the value of exams. The major value of the exam is, as far as I'm concerned, and as you know, I've been operating this subject in some capacity for a decade now, and we did have some particular problems until a few years ago, until we instituted a formal exam, and some people did some bad things, some shit went down, and there was a I had to bury a few bodies, and so exam it is, and I think that it's if any subject in the masters is worthy of having a formal exam, it's this one, because it is, of course, such a text-based subject, and it has, it is really, look at it as a kind of, it's clean and simple. You go into a big room, you sit at a table, and you write some stuff, and you show us what you're capable of in a short period of time. There's really there's 2 sections to the exam. There is, you know what, I'm going to, it's the wrong PowerPoint. There are 2 sections to the exam. There's they're just 2 essays, basically. That's all it is. So effectively you would have an hour for each of those, and you will just sit down and write your heart out over that period of time. One of the things that people often ask is, how much should I write? And the answer really is, you write as much as you can within 2 hours. What else can we say? I guess the other thing that's important, though, is that you write in a way that you write to an essay format. You have an argument, you put forward an argument, and you make it stick. You make it, substantive. So hypothetically, and I don't really like to put this these ideas into your head necessarily, but hypothetically you could have a decent page. If you could produce a high quality page in an hour that was an argument. But I really wouldn't advise that. I think that's a so you could hypothetically have 2 paragraphs and that be adequate at least. But as I say, I think you should probably aim for, depending how big your writing is, aim for 3 or 4 pages, and you really want to. I mean, apart from anything else, we ask you to bring in 3 examples in each of your essays. So that would be pretty difficult to get that happening in a page, wouldn't it? Not impossible, but probably pretty difficult to do. All right, this is what I want. Right. So the common cry, I hate exams, I've answered that, I think. The problem is, of course, that nobody likes exams. Absolutely nobody on earth likes exams. There is no liking of exams anywhere. It's the best possible way that we can say that we've, comprehensively and adequately assessed you and your understanding of the things that we've brought up in the subject. I don't know any other way to do it. As I just said, 2 parts to a 2-hour exam. There's 15 minutes of reading time beforehand, which you can't do anything except read in. You're not allowed to write on the paper or anything like that. And you're given some books to write in, or seems funny calling them books, but lined paper stapled together that you write on. I think you probably could get away with putting the 2 essays in one of those books, but if you want to, if you can have as many of those lined books as you want. So, I have seen people go up to 3 of those, but it gets pretty crazy when people start doing that. That's when they write, they can't do anything but write huge letters. So 2 essays. One is broadly theory-based, and Catherine covered some of those concepts that are going to be assessed in that section, and one is broadly history-based, but of course they overlap. In the section 2, so the nominally history section, there is some material that is there's a picture accompanying it, or a plan, or a picture. And those pictures are kind of conversation starters. So they're, you know, they illustrate a concept and they ask you to write about that concept. I think that what worries me about doing that, I like doing that in one sense. I think that's valid. They're not going to be, by the way, images that you've seen in the course, but they're going to be, you know, they're not going to shock you. They're not going to be, they're the kinds of things that you've seen in the course, but they're not entirely the things you've seen in the course. You're asked to talk about them. What I would really advise you against is spending a lot of time describing what you see in the image, and people have done that in the exam, and I think partly people just get a bit stuck and they're like, well, I've got to write something, I better write what I see before me. But I think it's important not to be dazzled by the fact that you've chosen to write about an image or a plan or something, and there it is. You know, don't tell us there are 45 streets in the suburb or whatever. You know, it's nice to know you can count, but it's not really, you know, core to what we want from you. Some of the other things that I think are important to remember, you know, it probably feels really weird that we're constantly telling you to reference material, and now we're saying in the exam, don't footnote. And please just don't footnote. There's no point. There's no value to it. No one's going to check your footnotes. They're not even going to look at that. They're just going to go, that's a bit silly. If you want to cite an author that you've read or that you enjoy, you admire, you ask to talk about a particular author, then by all means mention their name, mention the book that you're talking about or the text that you're talking about, please. If in some instance, if you can't remember the name of the author or the text, just give us the information that you can. We understand that, you know, I guess what I want to say is an exam is not a memory test, in a sense that we don't expect you to learn a whole lot of stuff and then turn up in the exam room and just like let it all out of your head. That's not what it's about. So it's about engaging with ideas, and what's important to us is that we understand what ideas you're talking about and how you're analysing them and so on. So as I said before, write an argued essay which is more important than the amount of words. And look, in the final year of high school, which was then known as the HSC in Victoria, my English teacher always talked about exams as a showcase of your knowledge, showcase of knowledge, which at the time I thought was ridiculous, but over the intervening decades I started to think, yeah, look, actually that's really what we want out of an exam. We want you to show up at the exam feeling like you know stuff, you want to tell us about it, you want to make a point or two, you want to show that you've been listening while you've been sitting here in this room with the pneumatic drill going off, you know, in some mysterious place somewhere in the building which I can never find. And I almost thought we should get a pneumatic drill going in the exam room just to make you feel a little more comfortable. But or just someone banging a hammer, or people going to the toilet. I don't know. But so you know, that's really what we want to see. We want to see you kind of, you know, I know we fully understand it's a stressful situation. We fully understand it's not optimum. It's not delightful. It's not going to be your best university moment, but it is. You might produce some of your best university work. Who knows? Okay, so I might have forgotten something. Is there anything anyone wants to ask about the exam?
Stationery. Are we supposed to use pen?
You bring a pen or pencil or both. Bring one of each if you want. But there's no other materials are allowed in the exam room. So you're totally, you know, on your own otherwise. But yes, please. I imagine if you show up without a writing utensil, they can probably provide one to you. But don't quote me on that. Okay. So very quickly, how many times have you heard me say that this semester? I just want to go through some of the things that I thought, having, you know, Catherine and I prepared the exam over the weekend, so we have a decent idea, as well we might, of what's in it. And I'm not going to, you know, give you outright clues, but there are some things that I think you want to be thinking about when you think about, you know, what we've talked about and thought about in the conduct of this course. Hopefully there are some things which you've really, you know, latched onto and found enjoyable and interesting. And hopefully, you know, we're not really testing your broader general knowledge or your experience. We're testing you on what you've understood from the course. But there's always going to be other things that are unique to you that might come in, that you can talk about, through the filter, through the lens of what you've learnt in planning theory and history this semester. So when we talk about history, there are some things that I, would like you to think about, broad conceptual ideas. I really like you to be thinking about, these kinds of, plans that seize on a moment, plans that are made, from a utopian point of view, perhaps, that are, in this case, obviously, after a horrendous conflagration, there are plans to rebuild entirely. I don't necessarily expect you to be spending a lot of time thinking about, the 17th century, but just as an idea, pulling everything down or everything's destroyed, let's build again. I'd like you to think about relationships between technology, between hygiene and health, those kinds of things. Planning, of course, has its origins, a significant part of its origins, its roots in fears about contagion and fears about, let's be frank, sort of racial health. That's a big part as well. In this instance, this image, we have cholera turning up in France from Spain, using the railway. I know it looks like a bull, but that's a joke about Spanish people. Turns up via the railway. Here I am to infect you all. Cholera being, just one of many horrendous illnesses that were prevalent in the 19th century. Planning, in this case, Haussmann, rebuilding Paris is in part rebuilding for the health of the French people. And the idea that planning can address these kinds of issues, and remember also that physical health, the spread of diseases is often bound up with moral health as well. And the moral element of planning is something that I think is worth thinking about too. Similarly, this beautiful image of the little suburbs of Paris being cleansed, that is also, an Haussmann idea. This notion of health and hygiene spreads into, for instance, you remember me talking briefly about Port Sunlight, which is, a company town built alongside a major soap factory near Liverpool in the UK in, I think, the late 1880s, early 1890s, and just the very idea of Port Sunlight soap, but its sunlight is, a disinfectant in itself, and so on. You'll remember, and I really don't want to spend a lot of time on this, I don't want you to either necessarily. If you find it an entrancing concept and you think it's worth talking about, then by all means talk about garden cities. You might want to talk about that early 20th century ideal. If you're going to talk about garden cities, I would like you to spend some time thinking about what they actually constitute, what they are, and what the original notion was in garden cities, particularly the original notion, because I think it's a great example of something that is misunderstood and misused over time, not just the confusion between the notion of the garden city and the notion of the garden suburb. And if you're not sure what that confusion is, then please reacquaint yourself with those ideas. They're very different notions. And don't tell us that Canberra is a garden suburb or a garden city, because my head will explode if I see that ever again. This particular thing, I don't think I showed you this, but this was a Facebook post by one of my best students who actually had the audacity to talk about overlaying a map of Howard's garden city over the, he reposted this thing, this hypothetical plan of Howard's over the top of a map of Canberra, as if that would possibly make sense, and then say that Canberra's shit. The guy, I can't believe I still talk to him. Some other things that I think are worth, and I'll go into this in greater detail shortly, but the notion of the transfer of ideas. This, I think, is really, really important and useful. And this is where I'd really like you to, this takes it out of, history for its own sake. Not that, obviously, I don't have a problem with that, but from your from the point of view of you guys, even if history is not your primary fascination or concern, like it is mine, you nevertheless would be interested in the idea of how ideas travel from place to place and can be used and reapplied in different places at different times. You might remember that Howard, when he was preparing his Garden Cities book, someone showed him, or somehow he saw a plan of Adelaide, and he was led to believe that Adelaide was a garden city in his style, because what he didn't realise was that the parklands are not where Adelaide ends. The parklands are just like, separate Adelaide, central Adelaide, from the suburbs. Nevertheless, he takes an element of that notion and he moves forward with it. He didn't realise that Adelaide had suburbs. I guess that's the point. If you were in a position to talk about Patrick Geddes, for instance, I think that would be way cool. I'd really like to see you applying some of the things. I think Geddes is someone who is really of our, he's of his time. He's of his time of 100 years ago, but a lot of the things that he talks about are applicable today. And even just those metaphors that he uses, like comparing his biology, which is his primary interest and his what he's trained in, and the way that societies and cultures, urban societies and urban cultures, grow or should grow, I think is really useful and important. So you could get a lot out of that if you wanted to. Talk about Geddes in India, talk about Geddes in Tel Aviv. All of these things I think are well worth pursuing if you have any sort of interest in that idea of taking in a way an old idea, maybe making it a universal idea. I think that a lot of what Geddes is talking about is still maybe more applicable today than it was then. And this takes me to the transfer and the morphing of ideas. Like in this instance, I really wanted to remind you of all that stuff that we talked about with the kind of the parallel universe that existed in the 20th century of communist planning. Still does exist in the present day, but certainly when the communists came to power in the USSR and Russia just over 100 years ago, we had a lot of new ideas that come forth which continue to have resonance and which I think from a planning point of view are still very, very important, particularly notions of the marshalling, the harnessing of resources and all the stuff that we hear about siloing was not technically was not possible in a proper communist country. But the Russians, as you will recall, were you may remember this when essentially a Russian colony in China, very successful city in the present day that had its origins in Russian planning, not communist planning, 19th century Russian planning. You may also recall things like this, another pre-communist exercise in a predominantly, in the 20th century, predominantly communist country. I found some interesting images from this painter Pimenov. You might remember that I talked about this as what an amazing series of changes had been wrought on urban Russia by communism, but also by planning, and how the modern city suddenly springs into view. Pimenov, don't have time to talk about this, and it's probably not incredibly relevant, but revisited this idea many times in his career, and consistently remade this as a commentary on Russian history. But this, in the 1960s, is particularly unusual and important, and he seemed to have become a much worse painter, but don't put that in the exam. Okay, so some of the things that I think are really useful to us to understand, for us to understand in engaging with bigger picture kind of stuff. Some of the things that came up, the idea of, this is a Le Corbusian idea in a sense, like the the house as a machine for living in. You remember that idea? And this is a Russian version of the same, where, you know, ultimate efficiency, very modern, streamlined living, where people will live in rooms but they don't really have private lives. They have very public lives, and these living combines, these communal houses, which many people thought were supposed to demolish the family. One of the things that I might have mentioned but wouldn't have made a lot of, even though we see this as kind of a way of, you know, perhaps in some ways not an ideal family lifestyle, and we might see it as quite a draconian way to force people to live in small apartments and, you know, nowhere to cook for themselves, or even no expectation that they eat in their apartments, that they would go and eat communally somewhere else in the building. What I always found slightly hilarious was that this was the ideal for many people, and this luxury apartment block, of which there were quite a few in Melbourne, built in the 1920s and 30s, exactly the same kind of concept, that people would be completely detached from their eating, their laundry facilities. They just live in little apartments and they'd come down and eat communally every day. So that was for the incredibly rich, and that was for everybody, you know, in Russia. That's the incredibly rich in Australia. So I guess, you know, these ideas of very streamlined, that idea of the machine for living in and so on, ideas about prescriptive living, which is, you know, really not alien to present-day planning in the nuts and bolts style of the 21st century in this country. You know, X number of people and you get a school. Those kinds of ideas. You know, the idea of catchment areas and so on, and provision of facilities for a certain amount of people, and the analysis of demographics and so on, and provision. Some of these ideas that about what do you call it? Linear cities as well. That, and this I thought was a particularly great example. It's only an example, but the Milutin idea for the linear city, where you know, the skinny little city that just like stretched out into the country, based in part on a Spanish model, put forward as a model for all kinds of places in the USSR, and then in the 1960s in Melbourne it was put forward as well as obviously exactly the same idea of creating a linear city out into Gippsland. That's one thing. That's just an example of how ideas morph and you know, transport themselves across decades and across places. I did want you to think a little bit about slums. We have often had, I'll let you into a secret, we have often had students say, give us the very basic idea about slums, which is an easy way to deal with slums, pull them down, and voila, no slums. It doesn't really answer the question of how places are perceived as slums, and perception is so important in this kind of thing. And the idea that there's no politics behind slums and, well, obviously gentrification and so on. If you know anything about the history of inner city Melbourne, you would know that slum clearance was a very contested issue, and it was by no means ever straightforward and easy to understand or undertake. So 1935 Carlton was a place that nobody in their right mind would ever want to live in, unless they absolutely had to. And of course we know that 80 years later, slightly different story. I think there's a lot of value for you looking at notions of slums. I know a lot of people who undertake the Masters of Urban Planning are fascinated by the notion of slums. Usually we tend to think of them as not really existing in this country anymore. But I would posit to you that that's a matter of perception and definition. So of course we have horrendous, scary places named after me. We also have all kinds of ideas about cultural vacuums and you know, I was trying to find images of you know, wealthy slum, rich person slum. I was trying to find some kind of idea of a cultural vacuum, a place where, you know, that was so soulless and unhappy, even though the people there were very wealthy. But you just can't find that. Google Images doesn't understand that idea. So I just got a whole lot of pictures of the rich dogs of Instagram instead. Doesn't really illustrate too much, but you know, and in fact they're probably having pretty good lives, I think. So maybe I should leave them well out of it. That won't be on the exam. Well, you can try and put that in the exam if you want to. You can try and answer a question along those lines. Australian suburbs are often talked about in those terms, though, as soulless and unexciting, and I think it'd be worth your while having a look at some of that rhetoric and thinking about that. We often find these kinds of, you know, historically we find this kind of research, and in this instance it's a pro-suburban kind of a study, isn't it? Because there's so much more, you know, infantile death there on the left-hand side, or infectious diseases, than there is in the suburbs on the right, in this Barnett depiction. We have the same kinds of stories put forward, not as attractively, but put forward in the present day with these same kinds of. I always feel like there's a moral underpinning to this, but that might just be me. Another thing that I did think you should be thinking about is the notion of demands, obligations, citizen engagement, participation. All of those things are really important to understand and be able to talk about in the exam. So you might remember that I talked about in the post-war era, and this is a British example, but doesn't have to be a British example, the rebuilding of Britain to a modern template, or the rebuilding a lot of urban Britain to a modern template, was seen to be a reward for the people who'd suffered so much during the Second World War. And this notion that this is what a better life entailed in the post-war era, you know, the best possible lives. And the notion of new towns as a way to, you know, get people out of the big city, you know, to a certain degree, following that Garden Cities template in a manner of speaking, or at least a part of it, and, you know, taking people to places like Milton Keynes. Really great thing to write about Milton Keynes, not just because of, you know, Lauren's brilliant take on it, but also as the most recent of the new towns in the UK, and, you know, very contested place, but there are new towns for everyone. You can all write about a new town if you want. In the instance of, I don't need to say much about Australia, but there's, you know, obviously there's comparisons, and we've talked about that as well in terms of Australian new town ideas and the notion of decentralisation in this country, which is a hot topic. And I think I might have conveyed to you that I'm hoping that it's a really, really hot topic, because I've put in a major Australian Research Council grant on exactly that topic, and I want to study that further. So I think it'd be very good for you to have a good working idea of what democracy constitutes. You know, I think you know, Michaela sort of touched on it, and I read from what he said that, you know, he was acknowledging it. It's a very thorny topic, but one well worth getting on top of. Equality is another difficult one. Get a working definition of those things and be prepared to talk about them. I won't talk about protest, although there's a lot to talk about, but we have talked about it. It goes across nations and has all kinds of forms. Citizen involvement. And citizen involvement, this is the example of the states in the UK. You have, you know, once again, I'm a bit of a Facebook stalker of all kinds of places around the world, and I see how people communicate with each other and express their disgust or, you know, pleasure or whatever. And being very aware that I have about 2 minutes left, and I also want to spruik my subject for next semester, so I will tell you that these slides are all sitting on LMS right now, and I don't even have time to tell you why Adelaide's speed limit is represented by a duck on a snail, I advise you to go back and revise some of these ideas about normativity, about who plans for whom. I think that's always important, and who is not being planned for or being allowed to plan for themselves. And so on. So I am going to end on time. I just want to say, good luck in the exam. You won't need that good luck. You're going to be fine. I want to spruik my subject for next semester. It's called City Lights. It's the subtitle is something like Cities Culture. Sorry, I can't remember. Cities Culture something. The handbook entry is there. It's a second semester subject. If there are any problems, if you want to do the subject and there are any issues with where you are in your candidacy, talk to me. We can probably work something out. We do spend a lot of time watching films in this subject, so in that sense it's enjoyable. However, you might go, well, yeah, but they're films that you picked, and that's also true. So it's certainly there's a lot less of me standing here talking, and there is a lot more of it's not just watching films, but that's a substantial part of it. It's about depiction of the city, and it's also about how culture is introduced into the city and becomes an integral part of cities, and how that makes city life worth living. So I hope you can join me in that. That's that from me. It feels like wrapping up the Emmys or something, or the Grammys, or the Oscars. Thank you very much, everybody, for being a part of this. And I don't know, Rebecca, thank you for coming to every lecture. Catherine, you're the co-coordinator, so I thank you, but I don't want to... is there anyone you want to thank?
Are there any questions? Okay, good luck.
Yeah, you won't need it. Thanks very much, everybody.